Howdy folks, my name's Christian and welcome to Bullish on Farming. Today is June 22nd, 32 with humidity. That's why I got the Kubota out. It's got its air conditioning working, thank God. I'm clearly collecting bales out of the fields. We've had some good weather, some periods in between rain to get some hay done. We've been hustling. Now I'm just collecting them before a rainstorm we got this afternoon. We're probably close to 200 bales. Not quite half there, but still some more to go. But as you can see, we've scooped them right up. Had some good hay this year. So I wanted to talk a little bit about hay and how that plays into us moving forward, how we're looking at hay, and tie that into a regenerative context. So those of you who aren't familiar with why you would produce hay, you need it to feed your animals through the winter. So if you have ruminant animals like cattle or sheep, they're going to require hay to survive through the winter months. Okay? The most expensive part of running animals is, well, for cattle at least, winter feed. Okay? Most people aren't familiar with haying. There's 3 steps to the process. You got to cut it, you got to rake it, and you got to bale it. All 3 of those steps require their own machines. A hay bind to cut, a rake to rake, and then a baler to bale, okay? You're talking about 3 pieces of equipment that aren't so cheap, okay? But you're going to need some winter feed if you're living in Canada, so you're gonna need to produce hay, okay? That's one thing. The next thing is, the longer your winter feeding season is, obviously that correlates with the cost. So if you can reduce your winter feeding season, you also reduce the costs associated with that. Okay? And how do you do that? You extend your grazing season, and so you reduce your requirements for producing winter feed. And it's a bit of a paradigm shift, but that's how the regenerative guys are looking at it. Because folks, you got to remember, when you're doing hay, you're taking all that nutritional value, all the seed, all the carbon from this field that's wrapped in those bales, and you're taking it off this field and you're bringing it somewhere else. Now in nature, what would happen is that carbon would eventually all fall to the ground, contribute to a carbon floor, and drop those nutrients into the soil where it grew, and would start a new growing cycle the next season. When you're taking hay off your fields 1 to 2 times a year, and they go through the winter, and you do that year after year, your land, you're not giving back to your land, you're taking from your land. And that's justifiable for people who got to feed their animals, but when you got a holistic outlook, you want to start changing things so that you're feeding your land and your animals at the same time. Why would you want to feed your land? Because it increases your fertility and increases the amount of feed and the quality of feed that you do have for your animals when grazing. Okay? So I'm not saying that you shouldn't be haying, but how are we looking at it moving forward? Okay? We're looking to extend our grazing season. Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, you got to manage your animals properly. If you're not doing rotational grazing or mob grazing, you got to start. You got to start managing the land and giving back to it consistently through proper livestock management. And you might have to do a little bit more than that, like rolling out carbon on your land to feed your soil, okay? People who have hurting fields, proper livestock management is a good place to start, okay? But if your soil is hurting, you're probably gonna have to throw down some carbon. Any area that you got bare soil, you should be putting carbon down on that, increasing the moisture retention of your fields. And that's a first main step into increasing your fertility And you got to do that consistently. It's not like you just do it for one season and things change overnight, right? It's about managing your land and your animals in an optimal way consistently. And so, you know, moving forward this year, what we're going to do is incorporate some hay fields that we won't get a second cut from and include those in the grazing program, and plan to give enough rest for the pastures we do have in rotation to save for stockpile when we start to get into fall. Okay, a lot of people are scared to put their cattle out in the fall because it's mud season, it's wet season. Oh, I don't want to put my cattle out there, they're just going to beat up my fields. Look, if you got bare soil and your fields are tapped out down to ground zero and they're waterlogged and pooling because there's no root system or carbon layer to retain that moisture, and so it only goes away if it's dried up by wind or sunlight, I understand why you wouldn't want to put your animals out there. I'm not saying to do that. What I'm saying is to increase the quality of your land so that you don't have those conditions. If you're building a carbon floor season after season, eventually, folks, you're gonna have 1 foot to 2 feet of a carbon layer between you and the soil, okay? And then the cattle's impact on that land will be reduced significantly. So that's the idea. You know, a lot of people's pastures are tapped out by late October, early November. And so they're feeding hay November, December, January, February, March, April. That's 6 months, folks. Half the year, some people have a winter feeding program for their animals for half the year, okay? And we're in Canada. I understand it's colder and our winters are longer. It's harder to work with. But you gotta work with your land and with your conditions. There are things you can do in the winter, okay? Although we're feeding hay to our cattle in the winter, January, February, and all the way up until mid-March, those cattle are bale grazing, okay? When the ground's frozen enough to not take the impact from the cattle, we have those bales positioned already, okay? Strategically, about 25 to 50 yards apart, and we limit the bale access with poly-braid electric fencing, and we move the cattle through the fields with a grazing mentality. And by doing so, we have a system in place to spread that manure in a typically dormant season and keep the cattle out on the land. Folks, before there was humans managing animals, the cattle would graze through the fall and winters. How did they do that? Well, they just did it. Why did it work though? Because the cattle kept moving. For those of you who run cattle, you know that they like more firm ground and sure footing. So if cattle entered an area that was wet, well, they might avoid it, but you can't avoid it entirely, and so they would move through it. Sometimes they wouldn't even spend a day in a field. They'd graze the tips and keep moving on. And that's the idea with extending your grazing season. You're not just keeping your cows out in a field for 3 weeks to a month. You got daily paddock rotations, and you've already built up your soil to the point that it can handle cattle impact for about 24 hours and keep moving, okay? So knowing that you're taking nutritional value from your land when you're haying from it, and that's if you're not grazing those fields and laying carbon back on it, but just using it for hay. Knowing that, then, and knowing the price of fuel that's gone up, the price of equipment and to repair it, plus the amount of time that it takes you to do haying, okay? In the world we live in today, it's starting to make a lot more sense to reduce your operational costs and increase or improve the way you manage your operation, okay? We're happy with the hay that we produce, all right, and how we have things running, but we do acknowledge that there is room for improvement. Of course we would like to do less haying, okay? Of course we would like to keep our animals on the land longer and let them do the work and, you know, get their feed on the land without us having to take from it to feed it to them, okay? And I encourage you guys to do some research if you're a farmer and look up what you can do. Again, you don't got to do it overnight, okay? So like I said, this year we're going to incorporate some hay fields. We're going to strategically plan out some fields that will be left for stockpile, which will have, you know, a very strong rest period before the cattle hit it in the fall. And we're going to choose those fields that already have a carbon floor so that they can handle the impact of the cattle, okay? I know for a lot of folks, hay is a tradition. It's pretty to look at. And some people are stubborn, they like producing their own hay. I'm a big fan of being self-sufficient and having a sustainable production. You can't do that if you're not producing the feed for your animals, okay? However, there is a leaning out that can be done for those who are still very operationally intensive with winter feed programs, okay? Not to mention that if you extend your grazing season and reduce the amount of winter hay that you need to feed, you're now at a point where you can sustainably grow, increase your stocking density, and start producing more beef on your land, which means that you have more income for the farm while reducing your costs, okay? Some folks can't fathom decreasing hay production and increasing stocking density of cattle, but it is possible, okay? A lot of people who are in trouble financially with their farm, if they knew what they could do, it would be an absolute game changer, okay? And that's why we're sharing this type of information, not to tell anyone what they should be doing, but what you can be doing and what we are doing and other regenerative farmers are doing, okay? This stuff works, folks. So just wanted to touch a bit on that and make some commentary on it. Got a lot more work to do today, so I'll probably cap this one off here. And I want to thank you guys for stopping by. See you on the next one.